una teoría que se extendió en la prensa, y es que pudo haber sido un accidente por una sedación de los niños. Ustedes han negado reiteradas veces que jamás a sus hijos para dormirles.
You know, I'm not even gonna answer that question, I'm afraid. All I'm gonna say is I'm Madeleine's mummy. I know she was taken from that apartment and she's out there. And I want her back. I mean, that is all. I mean, everything else, I'm sorry, is rubbish.
Madeleine did not vanish without a trace. The evidence suggests she died in that apartment, quietly, likely from a sedative meant to keep her asleep. There was no forced entry, no struggle, no intruder DNA. But cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of human decomposition behind the sofa, on Kate McCann's clothing, and in the family's rental car, obtained weeks later. Blood was found on the floor, partially matching Madeleine's DNA. The twins slept through the chaos, odd unless drugged. Kate, a medical doctor trained in anesthesia, had both motive and means. 3 children left alone while the parents dined nearby. Sedation wasn't improbable. It was practical. But what if something went wrong? What if Madeleine never woke up? Would a mother, in shock, admit a fatal mistake, or try to rewrite the ending? A broken window. A curtain caught in the breeze. A desperate scream. They've taken her. The story of abduction began there, but did the truth end hours earlier? What we know doesn't support kidnapping. It supports panic, cleanup, control. The only real question is not who took Madeleine, but whether anyone ever did. And if not, how far would 2 parents go to bury a tragedy no one was meant to uncover? Kate McCann wasn't just a mother on holiday. She was a medical professional, a general practitioner with specialized training in anesthesia. She understood how sedatives work, what they do, how long they last, and what happens when the dosage is wrong. That detail matters because it removes a common defense in most tragic domestic accidents: ignorance. If Madeleine was sedated the night she died, as many suspect, then it wasn't a careless decision made in parental desperation. It was a controlled action made by someone who knew exactly what she was administering. That is where the structure of suspicion begins. The motive was simple and, on the surface, even understandable: silence, rest, predictability. On May 3, 2007, Kate and Jerry McCann had plans to dine with friends at the Ocean Club Tapas Bar, just 50 meters from their apartment. They'd been doing it all week, leaving their children sleeping alone in the rental unit, checking in every 30 minutes. Madeleine cry or panic. The twins, just 2, would be less mobile but equally disruptive if awake. Ensuring the children slept undisturbed during dinner wasn't just convenient. So perhaps, and this is where the line between logic and suspicion sharpens, a low-dose sedative was used to keep all 3 children asleep through the evening. Calpol is often referenced, but Calpol, essentially liquid paracetamol, isn't a sedative in the clinical sense. It soothes fever and pain but doesn't cause unconsciousness. More likely, if any drug was involved, it was something stronger, something within the pharmacological scope of someone like Kate McCann. Diazepam, chloral hydrate, even over, the counter-antihistamines in higher doses, all are capable of inducing sleep, especially in young children. If such a drug was administered to Madeleine, and if she had a rare reaction, or if the dosage exceeded safe limits, respiratory depression could have set in. It only takes minutes. A child already lying down, already drowsy, wouldn't show much warning. She would simply stop breathing. And now the timeline begins, not the official one, but the one that emerges from what little data we have. If Madeleine died sometime between 7 and 9 p.m., before Kate's 10 p.m. discovery, then everything that follows would have required rapid, calculated action. The first instinct wouldn't have been to call emergency services, not if there was no chance of revival, not if panic overtook protocol, not if the cost of confession was prison, professional ruin, and the loss of their remaining children. Instead, the response becomes strategic. Control the narrative. Remove the cause. Introduce a new one. The window is opened. The curtain is staged. The front door is left ajar. Kate enters at 10 p.m., discovers the empty bed and screams the now infamous line, "They've taken her." Within minutes, the entire resort is mobilized. Within hours, the story is global. The world believes a kidnapping has occurred. And in that moment, the McCanns are no longer two parents facing unthinkable loss. They are victims of an outside evil. But the body, if this theory holds, was still inside the apartment, possibly hidden behind or under the sofa, where cadaver dogs later alerted to the scent of decomposition. The rental car, a silver Renault Scenic, wasn't acquired until May 27th, 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. That matters, because those same dogs later indicated the presence of human remains in the trunk of that vehicle. A forensic analysis found a hair and DNA samples consistent with Madeleine. Again, not definitive in court, but impossible to explain away as coincidence. Why wait 24 days? Several reasons emerge. Time buys planning. It reduces scrutiny. By then, the media storm had shifted public sympathy in the McCanns' favor. They had already met the Pope. They had appeared on British television. Donations were pouring in. The idea that they were anything but devastated parents had become offensive to suggest. Moving the body during this period would have been logistically safer, perhaps during a night when the resort was less occupied or while the investigation focused on leads far from the apartment. If a burial or disposal occurred, it happened under cover of attention, not in its absence. And here enters the third phase of the construct, media control. From the start, the McCanns had a team. Public relations firms, legal advisors, and private investigators were brought in not to solve the case, but to shape its presentation. When Gonzalo Amaral published his book in 2008, alleging Madeleine had died in the apartment, and the parents had covered it up, the McCanns sued him. Not once, but repeatedly. They eventually lost in Portugal's highest court, which ruled Amaral had a right to express his conclusions, even if unproven. The message from the McCanns, however, was clear. Anyone who challenged the abduction narrative would be met with litigation. Journalists were pressured. Newspapers issued apologies and settlements. Online critics were labeled conspiracy theorists. By 2010, the idea that Madeleine's parents could be complicit in her death had become almost taboo in mainstream British media, not because the facts had changed, but because the consequences had. And yet, the structure remained visible to those who looked. A sedative given for sleep. A child who never woke. A cover-up born not of malice, but of panic. A body hidden. A story rewritten. A world deceived, not for profit, not for revenge, but for survival. That's what makes this case so haunting. It doesn't require a predator. It doesn't require a motive beyond exhaustion. It only requires one bad decision, followed by a series of desperate ones. The open window. The unforced door. The scream too perfectly timed. These are not the clues of a kidnapping. They are the choreography of a cover-up. This isn't proof. It's a structure built on known facts, forensic indicators, behavioral analysis, and human psychology. But the longer you stare at it, the less it resembles theory, and the more it feels like design. Because if Madeleine died in that apartment, and the story we were told was crafted to hide it, then what happened in Praia da Luz was not just a tragedy. It was a controlled narrative, constructed to keep the truth buried with the child, who was never meant to wake up. In cases where there is no body, forensics becomes a language of suggestion. It doesn't speak in full sentences, but in fragments, scent, trace, presence. In the McCann case, these fragments whisper something no one wanted to hear. And they begin with the dogs. Eddie and Keela weren't ordinary dogs. They were elite British cadaver and blood detection canines, trained to identify the scent of human decomposition and the trace presence of blood. Brought to Portugal in July 2007, more than 2 months after Madeleine's disappearance, they entered apartment 5A and changed the conversation. Eddie, the cadaver dog, alerted to the scent of death in the McCanns' living room, specifically behind the sofa. He alerted again inside a bedroom wardrobe. He then alerted to a small piece of clothing that belonged to Kate. He sat firmly in front of the family's rented Renault Scenic. On the driver's side. On the key. and again in the trunk. Keela, the blood detection dog, was then brought in and separately indicated the same spots, behind the sofa and in the trunk of the car. 2 dogs, 2 skill sets, 2 separate alerts, months after any alleged abduction. That's not coincidence. That's evidence speaking, even if no one wants to listen. Behind the sofa in apartment 5A, forensic teams found a trace amount of blood. It had partially degraded due to cleaning products, humidity, and time. But under low copy number DNA testing, controversial, but used in several UK cases, a partial profile was retrieved. It matched 15 out of 19 alleles consistent with Madeleine's genetic profile. Not conclusive, not prosecutable, but in a case with zero trace of any stranger. Finding 79% of a missing child's DNA in a location where she wasn't supposed to bleed is not irrelevant. It's unexplained. It shouldn't be there. And yet, no one has offered a coherent alternative. Then there's the car. The McCanns rented the Renault Scenic 24 days after Madeleine disappeared. Why rent a car nearly a month later? The family had remained in Praia da and impossible to confuse. No other animal object or substance triggers that response. The diaper excuse fails immediately, as does the meat explanation, unless the meat was a human corpse. Skeptics often argue that dog alerts aren't legally binding. That's true. A dog's signal is not proof. It must be corroborated with physical evidence. But in this case, the dogs pointed, again and again, to places no narrative of abduction accounts for. The dogs didn't alert to strangers. They alerted to the McCanns' belongings, to their rental vehicle, to the child's toy, to the wardrobe, to the space behind the couch. These aren't random spots. These are zones of concealment, of containment, of hiding. The pattern becomes even harder to ignore when you look at the timeline. Madeleine vanished on May 3rd. The dogs arrived in July. If these scents were residual from before, they would have needed to survive multiple cleanings, heat, humidity, and 2 months of traffic. And still, they triggered trained responses. That makes them extremely unlikely to be false positives. More importantly, no cadaver scent was found in any other apartment in the complex. No other car. No other item. Just the McCanns. And then there's the book. Among the items collected from the apartment was Kate's personal copy of the Bible. According to official police records, Eddie alerted to it as well. Not just clothing, not just furniture. A book, something handheld, not easily contaminated, something a mother might hold tightly while grieving. If decomposition scent was present there, it means contact, proximity, intimacy, a body held, a body mourned, not stolen. Even with all this, the counterarguments persist. Supporters of the McCanns claim that the evidence is circumstantial, that dog alerts aren't science, that low copy number DNA testing is too unreliable, that the apartment had been contaminated by hundreds of people over time, that the car could have been used to transport garbage, groceries, or baby wipes. But none of those explanations account for the focused consistency of the alerts. If this were contamination, we'd expect randomness. Dogs hitting on various objects, spread across unrelated zones. But here, everything ties back to 3 things: the body, the apartment, the car. And there's no fourth. This forensic narrative doesn't prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But it raises a far more uncomfortable certainty. The official story cannot explain the forensics. It doesn't even try. The abduction scenario offers no reason for blood behind the couch, for a death scent in the rental car, for DNA on the car key, for a cadaver dog sitting in front of Kate McCann's clothing. It offers no timeline for a body ever being in the car, because by the official version, there never was a body. So we're left with silence. Not just the silence of a child who never called out, never cried for help, never left a trace of struggle, but the silence of science ignored, of evidence dismissed, of responses too casual for the magnitude of what was being alleged. And that silence speaks louder than any testimony. Forensics doesn't lie. It doesn't dramatize. It doesn't speculate. It only shows you what was there and what was touched. When that picture begins to take shape, the emotional appeal of abduction loses force. You begin to ask not who entered the apartment, but what never left it. If Madeleine died in apartment 5A, the forensics didn't scream it, but they whispered, clearly, repeatedly, and only to those still willing to listen. Criminal cover-ups are rarely spontaneous. They are built, layered, rehearsed, and if done hastily, they usually leave behind one fatal flaw: time. Inconsistencies in timeline are among the first indicators of staged narratives. In the disappearance of Madeleine, the timeline given by the parents and their friends, known collectively as the Tappa 7, was meant to demonstrate routine, responsibility, and vigilance. Instead, it opened more questions than it answered. According to their collective account, the group followed a check system that involved members taking turns leaving the table at the tapas restaurant to check on their children every 30 minutes. On the surface, it sounds plausible. Practical even. A rotating parental surveillance team during a holiday dinner. But the closer you examine it, the less stable it becomes. First, there is no independent verification that these checks occurred at all. No staff at the restaurant recall anyone getting up systematically. No CCTV footage confirms the pattern. No neighbor saw movement consistent with a back-and-forth check every half hour. And among the group themselves, accounts vary. Some say the first check was at 8:30 p.m., others at 8:45. Jerry McCann claims he checked Madeleine at 9:05 p.m. Jane Tanner insists she saw a man carrying a child, possibly Madeleine, at 9:15 p.m. But even that sighting has been challenged by the couple later identified as carrying their own daughter home. The story of the timeline bends under pressure, offering convenience instead of clarity. Then there's the handwritten timeline. It wasn't given to police during the initial statements. It wasn't submitted as a coordinated group document. It was found later in Kate McCann's belongings. A hand-drawn chart listing who checked which apartment at what time. On paper, it looks like a record. In context, it looks like reconstruction. In reality, it may be rehearsal. The issue with this handwritten note is not just its late discovery. It's the precision. The clean sequencing. The structured nature of a memory that should have been chaotic. If your child disappeared, and police asked you what happened, would your response be a prepared table of timestamps written in pen? Or would you describe moments, impressions, fragments of a night that collapsed under trauma? The presence of this chart doesn't prove guilt, but it suggests forethought, or, more dangerously, post-thought, an effort to reinforce a story that was built after the fact. And then, the window. Kate claimed to have entered the bedroom just after 10 p.m. and found the window open, the shutter raised, and the curtain billowing outward. A dramatic visual that would reinforce the idea of a nighttime intruder. But this detail didn't appear in the earliest police statements. It emerged later as media pressure grew and inconsistencies mounted. Crime scene photos taken shortly after the discovery show the curtain resting still. No signs of forced entry, no disturbance around the window frame, no foreign fingerprints, no debris. The shutter itself could only be opened from the inside, unless extreme force was used, which it wasn't. Why then would Kate say the curtain blew in? Why would the story evolve to include this cinematic image? Because it fits the script. It feeds the narrative of abduction. An open window, a moving curtain, a missing child. It paints the picture the world expects to see, not the one forensics actually show. The Portuguese police were immediately skeptical. In their final report, they noted that the crime scene had been compromised, possibly altered before investigators arrived. Photographs were taken, but by then, beds had been touched, shutters manipulated, and furniture moved. The scene, they wrote, felt unnaturally arranged, and in staged environments, small inconsistencies often betray larger fabrications. One glaring absence was the lack of defensive behavior. If Kate truly believed someone had broken into the apartment and taken her daughter, why wasn't the room torn apart? Why didn't she run through the resort screaming Madeleine's name? Why was her first reaction to say, with near-scripted precision, "They've taken her"? Not, "She's gone." Not, "Where is she?" But a direct attribution of an external perpetrator. In crisis psychology, such specificity especially before processing the scene, is rare, and when present, it often indicates prior knowledge. This connects to the fourth and most technological flaw in the narrative: surveillance. The Ocean Club Resort had limited CCTV coverage, but what it did have showed no footage of a suspicious person leaving the area with a child. None of the surrounding buildings captured an image of a man carrying a girl. The timing of all alleged checks coincides with no verified third-party observation. No kitchen staff, no guests in nearby apartments, no passing pedestrians reported seeing anything suspicious, no hurried movement, no struggle, no child being carried. If someone had indeed entered through the window, passed by multiple doors and patios, and escaped with a child in their arms, someone should have seen something. No one did. Even the man Jane Tanner saw at 9:15 p.m., whose image was used in press campaigns for years, turned out to be a fellow holidaymaker, carrying his own child home from a nearby apartment. That sighting, once considered the core of the abduction theory, disintegrated under proper identification, and with it, so did one of the few, confirmed, events in the timeline. In reality, there is no fixed timeline. There are statements. There are revisions. There are memory gaps. And then there is a handwritten schedule, discovered too late, constructed too neatly, defended too aggressively. In high-profile disappearances, timing is everything. It tells us what could have happened, what couldn't, and who had opportunity. In the case of Madeleine, the timeline doesn't build confidence. It builds doubt. It's not just the lack of alignment between witnesses. It's not just the evolving curtain story or the retroactive discovery of a schedule. It's the overall impression that time in this case is not linear, it is circular. A loop of explanations chasing the shadow of a child who, by all forensic accounts, may have died long before 10 p.m. And that matters. Because if Madeleine died earlier, if something went wrong before the official discovery, then everything that followed may have been a performance. The 30-minute checks, the calm dinner, the dramatic discovery, the open window. Each piece, added not in real time, but in hindsight, like layers of stage lighting, positioned after the final scene had already ended. Criminal justice isn't built on hunches. It's built on patterns. And in this case, the pattern of the timeline is one of controlled narration, not reactive chaos. Which leaves us with a final question. If this timeline is built on reconstruction, not recollection, then what exactly was being remembered? And more chillingly, what was being rewritten? In criminal investigations, words matter. Not just what is said, but how, when, and under what conditions. Language in moments of crisis is raw, unfiltered, and often deeply revealing. That's why investigators, psychologists, and profilers study the first words uttered in traumatic situations. They are, more often than not, the most honest part of the story, even when the story is false. In the disappearance of Madeleine, one line has echoed louder than any other. "They've taken her." Spoken by Kate McCann at approximately 10 p.m. on May 3, 2007, upon returning to apartment 5A and finding her daughter missing. This single sentence has been repeated in every documentary, headline, and analysis of the case. It's the quote that launched an international search. It's also the quote that cracked the surface. The issue isn't that Kate said it. The issue is how she said it, instantly, without checking the room, without calling out Madeleine's name, without questioning whether her daughter had simply wandered. Her instinctive response wasn't confusion, wasn't Madeleine, or she's gone. It was a definitive, absolute, accusatory statement. They've taken her. 3 words loaded with narrative. No uncertainty, no hesitation. Just a conclusion presented as fact. To understand why this is significant, we must first explore how people typically respond to the unexpected disappearance of a child. In countless real-world cases, the first reactions are disorientation, denial, panic. Parents shout the child's name, search closets, bathrooms, under beds, in hallways. They yell, they plead, they run outside. The word, abduction, is rarely the first assumption. It comes later, if ever, after the possibility of wandering or accidental injury has been ruled out. And when it is spoken, It is usually tentative. Could someone have taken her? Do you think she's been kidnapped? It's posed as a question. Because in real trauma, people don't lead with certainty. They lead with fear. Kate didn't. Her statement, "They've taken her," was not only definitive, it was theatrical. It carried the weight of someone who already knew what had happened. And that's where suspicion starts, not because it proves anything, but because it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the psychology of an innocent parent discovering a child's disappearance for the first time. It doesn't fit the behavior of someone with no prior knowledge of what they're walking into. It fits someone who's already grieving, or worse, already covering. The scene around the statement is equally strange. By her own account and that of those nearby, Kate entered the apartment alone, walked to the bedroom, and returned moments later shouting the infamous line. She didn't call for Madeleine. She didn't tear the room apart. She didn't search other areas of the apartment. There was no report of her checking the bathroom, the closets, or the patio. The twins, Sean and Amali, were still asleep, untouched by the noise. And then came the scream. Witnesses say she ran out, hysterical, repeating the same phrase, "They've taken her. They've taken her." Again and again, as if repeating a line she already believed. Some would call this instinct. Others, performance. What makes this moment more suspicious is what followed, or rather, what didn't. According to police reports, Kate did not appear to have searched thoroughly before concluding her daughter had been abducted. The initial moments, those crucial telling seconds, lacked the chaos typical of a real-time, unfiltered reaction. Instead, they had a strange coherence, a clean sequence, a message already formed. This doesn't prove deception, but it raises a critical question. How did she know? How could a mother, returning from dinner, walk into a quiet apartment and immediately, without exploration, conclude that her child had been taken by someone else? There are only a few explanations. One is that she walked into the scene and saw clear signs of abduction, a broken window, a wide open door, a missing child's toy, a trail of movement. But according to police, those signs weren't there. The window showed no evidence of forced entry. The shutters were intact. There were no footprints, no disturbances, no foreign DNA. The curtain, famously described by Kate as blowing in the wind, was found undisturbed by investigators. In other words, the physical scene did not match her verbal conclusion. Another possibility is that her mind filled in the gaps. That panic led her to assume the worst. But that explanation falters when placed against the actual behavior. In high-stress interviews and interrogations, language analysts look for what's called anticipatory knowledge, signs that a person may be drawing from information they shouldn't have yet. Phrases like, "they must have done it," or "I knew it," used too early in a timeline can indicate foreknowledge, a cause without examining the effect. And in that, it suggests not panic, but pre-existing belief. This is what led Portuguese investigators, early in the case, to suspect the possibility of a staged crime scene. If Madeleine had died earlier, perhaps due to a sedative, an accident, or unknown health complication, and her disappearance had been reconstructed as an abduction, then, "they've taken her," wouldn't be a reaction. It would be an entrance line, the beginning of an alibi. Of course, this cannot be proven. Language is subjective, behavior is complex. Trauma expresses itself in unpredictable ways. Some argue that Kate's background in medicine may have made her calmer in crisis. Others suggest her statement was misheard, misquoted, or taken out of context. These are valid points, but they don't erase the fundamental irregularity of the moment. Because what's notable here isn't just the content of the words. It's the absence of others. Not once, in the immediate aftermath, did Kate McCann reportedly scream, "Madeleine." Not once did she cry out her daughter's name into the hallway, the night. That, above all else, haunts this moment. Because every parent knows the first thing you shout, before police, before assumptions, before anything, is the name of your child. And she didn't. In true crime, we learn not to hang a case on one phrase. But we also learn to mark when words don't match the scene. when emotion arrives too clean, when declarations come faster than discovery, "They've taken her," is not proof. But it is the first fracture in a narrative that tried too hard to hold. The most dangerous lies aren't told out of hatred. They're told out of fear. And in the case of Madeleine, the possibility that her death was accidental, not malicious, opens up a psychological landscape far more complex than most true crime cases allow. If the central theory is true, that Kate McCann administered a sedative to help her children sleep, and that Madeleine died from an unintended reaction, then the decision not to call for help wasn't born from criminal intent. It was born from terror, a split-second recognition that a fatal mistake had just destroyed everything. Kate McCann was a doctor, a general practitioner with training in anesthetics. She knew exactly what drugs did. She knew what they were for, what could go wrong, and what would happen if authorities found out. That knowledge alone is enough to produce fear when something goes wrong. But the stakes weren't just professional. They were existential. If Madeleine died under her care, even accidentally, Kate would almost certainly have faced criminal charges, in a foreign country, under unfamiliar laws, with a police force already skeptical of her behavior. The Portuguese authorities had the power to detain her, strip her of her medical license, and pursue charges ranging from negligence to manslaughter. The prospect of facing those charges alone would have been overwhelming. But that's just the legal dimension. The personal consequences were even more devastating. Kate and Jerry had 2 other children, twins Sean and Amali, barely 2 years old at the time. If she had been arrested, if the death had been framed as medical negligence or reckless endangerment, she could have lost custody. Social services, either in Portugal or back in the UK, might have intervened. The narrative of unfit mother could have emerged almost overnight, driven by tabloid frenzy and public outrage. For a woman who had built her identity around family, medicine, and control, this would have been unbearable. There's also the public dimension. The shame, the irreversible destruction of reputation. Kate McCann wasn't just a mother, she was, at the time, still a practicing physician in the NHS. The media scrutiny would have been merciless. A doctor kills her child with drugs. That headline writes itself, regardless of nuance, regardless of intention. The pressure to avoid that outcome, to preserve the image of the loving, competent mother, would have been suffocating. And in that pressure cooker, decisions are made that don't follow logic. They follow instinct. Psychologists refer to this as panic logic, a state of mind in which the fear of consequences becomes so overwhelming that self-preservation overrides ethical judgment. The person isn't thinking about right or wrong. They're thinking about survival. They're not calculating public reaction. They're drowning in dread. And often, the first decision, the initial lie or omission, is the most important one. Because after that, every move becomes an attempt to protect that lie, to hold the illusion together, to survive the fallout that never stops growing. This is what makes the McCann case so plausible under the theory of accidental death and cover-up. It doesn't require evil. It requires fear. It requires a mother who believes she will be destroyed if the truth comes out. And so she hides it. She constructs an alternative version of events, one with villains outside the home, not tragedy within it. And as history shows, this type of reaction is not rare. In 2011, in the United States, the case of Casey Anthony made global headlines. Anthony's 2-year-old daughter Kaylee vanished. For 31 days, Anthony said nothing. When questioned, she claimed a babysitter had kidnapped the child. Later, Kaylee's remains were found in a wooded area near the family home. Though Anthony was ultimately acquitted of murder, prosecutors argued that Kaylee had died in an accident, and that Anthony, terrified of being blamed, had hidden the body and fabricated the kidnapping story to protect herself. In 2014, in Australia, a mother named Rachel Fitzner was found guilty of manslaughter after her child died from head trauma. Fitzner admitted that after her son stopped breathing, she didn't call for help. Instead, she kept the body in her apartment for several days, terrified of losing custody of her other children. She later buried the child in a shallow grave, still claiming innocence until confronted with evidence. Even more recently, in 2019, a mother in the UK was arrested after her infant was found dead in her home. Rather than seek help, she spent hours cleaning the scene, hiding evidence, and creating a story about a mysterious illness. She later admitted she panicked, not because she meant to harm the child, but because she knew what it would look like. In all these cases, the underlying emotion wasn't hatred. It was fear. Raw, irrational, overwhelming fear. The same kind of fear that could have gripped Kate McCann in a dim, quiet apartment in Praia da Luz. This fear also explains the emotional split that followed. On one side, public Kate, the grieving mother, composed in interviews, praying at vigils, pleading for her daughter's return. On the other, private Kate, silent during police interviews, refusing 48 key questions, lawyered up, protected. This duality is not unusual in high-stress trauma responses. But it's also consistent with someone trying to maintain a narrative they can no longer fully control. Over time, this fear morphs into something deeper: guilt. Not just for what happened, but for what was done after, for the lie that now defines everything. And yet, the longer the lie holds, the harder it is to undo. There's no way back from global victimhood, no easy pivot from "help us find our daughter" to "here's what really happened." The image becomes a prison. The grief becomes a role. The search becomes a cover. And at some point, even the liar may start to believe the lie. Psychologists call it cognitive accommodation, the brain reshaping memory to match survival instinct. It's not always conscious. It's not always malicious. But it's real. People convince themselves they acted out of love, out of protection, out of fear. And perhaps they did. But the child is still gone. The truth is still missing. If Kate McCann made a mistake and then buried it under panic and pretense, she wouldn't be the first. She wouldn't be the most monstrous. She would be human, deeply flawed, deeply terrified, and now trapped in a story too big to escape. What makes this theory painful is that it doesn't offer closure. It doesn't give us a villain. It gives us a mother, one who may have held her daughter in her final moments, realized the unthinkable, and made the worst possible choice out of pure, unfiltered fear. And that's what separates justice from psychology. The law asks what you did, but fear explains why you didn't stop it. In the disappearance of Madeleine, silence became fuel, not for closure, but for inquiry. When the official investigation stalled, and when institutions refused to connect dots hiding in plain sight, the public took over, not as a mob, but as a method. They weren't looking for sensation. They were looking for logic. On social media, an entire ecosystem of amateur investigators has grown over the years, driven not by conspiracy, but by contradiction. Instead of viral outrage, many of these voices built slow, disciplined case files, timelines reconstructed from media appearances, statements cross-referenced with official documents, and forensic inconsistencies mapped out with near clinical precision. Some have gone as far as translating Portuguese police files line by line, highlighting not just what was said, but what was omitted. These accounts don't scream guilt. They ask, again and again, why doesn't the official story hold up under basic scrutiny? Why does the handwritten timeline of parental checks appear late in the investigation? Why does Kate McCann say, "They've taken her," before verifying anything? Why do cadaver dogs alert in places an abduction theory can't explain? On Reddit, discussions around the McCann case span years. Subreddits focused on unresolved crimes have broken down every known element of the story, from forensic findings to behavioral cues. In one widely shared post, users compiled a side-by-side comparison of Kate and Jerry's police interviews, public statements, and their later memoir. The result was a mosaic of inconsistencies, changes in who checked on the children, when, how the window appeared, what time dinner ended, and when the screaming started. The question isn't, did they lie? It's, why is there so much they had to adjust? Another post explored how trauma manifests in real cases of missing children. Survivors, parents, and psychologists weighed in. The consensus, initial behavior usually reflects confusion, not certainty. But in this case, Kate's first words, "they've taken her," struck many as unnaturally composed, almost scripted, not because she's guilty, but because it felt preloaded. And when behavior feels rehearsed, people ask, what was she preparing for? This isn't idle speculation. It's logic responding to gaps. And those gaps keep widening. One of the most common frustrations among these communities is silence. Not the silence of Madeleine, but of her parents. Kate refused to answer 48 police questions. Among them, did you give Madeleine any medication? Did you open the bedroom window that night? Did Madeleine ever sleep with her siblings? Her refusal wasn't criminal, but it was telling. Silence in a moment of urgency doesn't suggest innocence. It suggests fear or something to protect. And so the internet protected something else, the integrity of the question. For years, mainstream media distanced itself from the idea that the McCanns could be involved. Fear of lawsuits, political pressure, sympathy. But online, where the cost of doubt isn't dictated by advertisers, people asked what official channels would not. If nothing went wrong inside that apartment, why do so many details keep pointing inward, not outward? What began as curiosity evolved into structure. Entire communities emerged that cataloged documents, photographs, statements, and expert reports. Some mapped the resort's layout using 3D reconstructions to test the plausibility of the window abduction theory. Others recreated the timeline minute by minute to reveal contradictions in witness statements. Still others cataloged known cases of sedation in pediatric settings, noting how easily a small miscalculation could prove fatal. But it wasn't just forensic curiosity, it was emotional fatigue. The internet didn't turn on the McCanns because of hatred. It turned because of exhaustion, with inconsistencies, with evasions, and with the sense that the truth was always just out of reach, but never out of sight. A recurring question in these communities is simple, almost brutal in its clarity. If you didn't do anything wrong, why not just tell the whole truth? And when that question echoes across thousands of voices, not tabloids, but researchers, parents, survivors, and legal observers, it becomes something more than doubt. It becomes indictment by omission. In many ways, the digital community has become the only body still treating this case as unresolved. Police forces shifted focus. Politicians shifted funding. The media shifted narratives. But the public, the segment unwilling to forget, keeps compiling, cross-checking, and remembering. Because unlike institutions, the crowd doesn't need consensus. It only needs the next inconsistency. And that's what keeps the theory alive. Not drama, not spectacle, but math. Statements that don't align. Behavior that doesn't track. Timelines that collapse under daylight. Photos that contradict interviews. And the relentless, tireless instinct to say, wait. That doesn't make sense. It's a reminder that public memory doesn't disappear just because the headlines do. A reminder that justice doesn't always come from inside the system. Sometimes, it's built outside of it, one quiet doubt at a time. And above all, a reminder that stories only stay whole when the facts do. In September 2007, Kate and Jerry McCann were no longer just grieving parents. They were declared arguidos, official suspects, by Portuguese police. This shift came 4 months after their daughter vanished, and followed a chain of developments that unsettled even those closest to the case. Cadaver dogs had alerted to the scent of death in their apartment. A second dog alerted to human blood in the same locations. DNA samples returned partial matches to Madeleine in places no child should have blood. But more than the science, it was the story that began to unravel. The timeline changed. Details appeared late. Under Portuguese law, arguido status means more than suspicion. It provides certain legal protections, the right to remain silent, to have an attorney, to avoid self-incrimination. But it also reflects belief by police that the person may have committed or participated in a crime. In this case, that belief was building. Yet less than a year later, in July 2008, Portuguese prosecutors announced they would not bring charges against the McCanns. The arguido status was lifted. The investigation was archived. The reason, insufficient evidence. That phrase hangs heavy. The paradox of the Madeleine case is this: almost everything points towards something going wrong inside apartment 5A. The dogs, the DNA, the missing window of time. The parents' refusal to answer 48 critical police questions. The rented car. The delay in calling authorities. The behavior that seemed more rehearsed than reactive. But despite all of this, there is no body, no weapon, no confession, no eyewitness. And in criminal law, absence weighs more than doubt. But public suspicion does not operate on courtroom standards. It operates on logic, memory, and the refusal to forget. That refusal reached its sharpest expression in 2008, when Gonçalo Amaral, the lead detective dismissed from the case under political pressure, published a book, The Truth of the Lie. In it, Amaral outlined a theory: Madeleine had died in the apartment, possibly due to sedation or a fall, and her parents, fearing prosecution and public disgrace, had hidden the body and staged an abduction. It was a theory not born in tabloids, but from inside the investigation itself. Amaral's claims mirrored the direction the police had been going, until they were forced to stop. The McCanns responded swiftly. They filed a defamation suit. They claimed the book caused emotional damage and undermined the global campaign to find their daughter. For a time, they won. A lower court banned the book, awarding them compensation. But Amaral appealed, and the case climbed all the way to the Portuguese Supreme Court. In 2017, the court ruled in Amaral's favor. Their decision was not an endorsement of his theory. It was a defense of his right to publish it. The court stated clearly, Amaral's conclusions were based on publicly available police records, and as such, did not constitute defamation. More strikingly, they acknowledged that his version of events had not been disproven, only unproven. The book was reinstated. The damages were reversed. The McCanns had lost. The ruling did not accuse them. But it didn't protect them either. Instead, it reinforced a truth more difficult to swallow, that in the absence of hard evidence, every uncomfortable possibility is allowed to stand, even those that point inward. And still, the law stayed quiet. Madeleine has never been declared dead. This may seem like a gesture of hope, but legally, it blocks a fundamental process: closure. Without death certification, insurance cannot be claimed. Estate matters remain unresolved. Most of all, criminal theories cannot proceed based on a fatality that no court has confirmed. It creates a legal purgatory, one in which no one can be charged, because the crime hasn't been named. In 2011, Scotland Yard launched Operation Grange, a multi-million-pound review of the case. At first, it was pitched as an open-ended reinvestigation. But as years passed, it narrowed its focus away from the McCanns and onto an unnamed foreign suspect later revealed as Christian Brouw-Yickner, a convicted offender living in Portugal at the time. Yet Brouw-Yickner has never been charged in connection with the case. And his link, even according to prosecutors, remains circumstantial. So while official efforts pivot elsewhere, a darker truth remains untouched. The strongest evidence in this case still surrounds the apartment, not the streets. Still haunts the McCanns' rental car, not the strangers outside. Still points to something domestic, not foreign. Quiet, not violent. And yet, without confirmation of death, no one is forced to confront that. This is where the law fails, not by error, but by absence. The absence of a body. The absence of confession. The absence of resolution. In that void, justice isn't just delayed, it's denied. Not because someone got away, but because someone might have, and there's nothing left to say. And so, the public fills the silence. Online communities, journalists, even former detectives continue to follow the case, not because they know the answer, but because they sense one was buried. They remember the curtain that didn't move, the Bible that may have carried a scent, the check-ins that didn't add up, the story that kept shifting, and the scream that sounded more like a script than a discovery. The law does not condemn them for remembering, but it doesn't encourage it either. In this way, the Madeleine case becomes something more than a mystery. It becomes a symbol, of what happens when systems cannot speak with certainty. When evidence is suggestive, but not definitive. When truth knocks, but the courtroom doesn't open. For some, that means the McCanns are innocent, victims of unthinkable tragedy and global suspicion. For others, it means they are protected by a silence the law refuses to breach. But for everyone, it means this: there is no justice without truth, and there is no truth without consequence. And perhaps that is the most chilling possibility of all, that a child may have died. And the world kept searching for someone to blame, while the answer waited behind the bedroom door. Because when the law goes quiet, stories take its place. But stories do not bury children. People do. In the absence of a confession, a body, or a conviction, the story of Madeleine remains a chasm lined with facts that refuse to disappear, and questions that refuse to die. It is not a solved crime. But it is not an unsolved one either. It lives in between, where evidence whispers and silence thickens. The theory that Madeleine died inside apartment 5A, and that her death was concealed out of fear, not intent, has never been legally proven. And yet, it has also never been legally disproven. This uncomfortable truth has left the public caught between two poles, sympathy and suspicion. And in that tension, a darker possibility has taken root, not because people want it to be true, but because no other explanation fully holds. This is not about accusation. It's about recognition. That there are too many details that won't go away. A rental car that smelled of death, 24 days after the disappearance. Forensics inconclusive, but not dismissive. Cadaver dogs alerting in 5 separate locations, including the Bible Kate McCann reportedly kept close. A list of 48 police questions left unanswered. A timeline revised after the fact. A scream that spoke of kidnapping before anything was confirmed. These may not be proof, but they are not fiction either. If Madeleine had been abducted by a stranger, there would be evidence of intrusion. There would be a trail. There would be a pattern. But none emerged. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no credible leads. Not even the resort's security cameras, placed to watch tourists and outsiders, captured anything. Instead, the anomalies exist within the story of those closest to her. And that is where the discomfort begins. Kate McCann may be a mother overwhelmed by loss. But she may also be a mother who made a decision that shattered everything. True crime, at its best, allows both to coexist, not as equal truths, but as parallel possibilities. What we do know is this: the behavior of the McCanns, from their media strategy to their legal resistance, has always been more defensive than revelatory. Why? Because maybe the question is no longer, who killed Madeleine? Maybe the real question is, when did the truth stop breathing? Was it the night of May 3, 2007? Before the press arrived, before the police interviewed, before the narrative crystallized? Or was it later, when facts no longer aligned with statements, when support became performance, and when lawyers replaced clarity? In many unsolved cases, the truth is simply lost. But here, the fear is that it was deliberately hidden. Not out of malice, but out of desperation, out of the primal terror of losing not just a child, but a life, a career, a family, and the identity of being good. Because if the death was accidental, it might not have been unforgivable. But the cover-up, the silence, the careful scripting, that's where sympathy begins to crack. True crime is not built on certainty. It's built on tension between what we see and what we're told. And in the McCann case, the tension has never loosened. Instead, it has spread across police files, across timelines, across interviews, across years of unanswered questions. And through it all, the public kept watching. Not because of bloodlust, but because something always felt off. The most chilling thing about this case is not the loss itself. It is how quickly everyone seemed to accept that the truth might never come. The system moved on. The press found other headlines, but the public, or at least, the part of it that doesn't forget, kept digging. They remembered the missing time, the sedative theories, the curtain that moved only in memory, and the words that were never quite right. They've taken her. Not, where's Madeleine? Not, she's gone. But a complete, confident narrative in the first moment of discovery. That is where true crime begins its work. Not by proving guilt, but by asking, again and again, does this make sense? And if not, what is being protected, and by whom? The law did not convict Kate or Jerry McCann, and that matters. No one should be declared guilty without proof. But absence of evidence is not evidence of innocence. Especially not when the available details, partial, fragmented, but persistent, create a silhouette that won't fade. And so the theory remains, not fact, not fantasy, but possibility. A shadow cast by things that didn't line up. A darkness formed not from accusations, but from contradictions. This is what makes it dangerous and necessary. Because when light cannot reach the end of a story, we are forced to trace the outlines in the dark. And in doing so, we discover that sometimes shadows say more than silence. Madeleine's case has become more than a mystery. It's become a meditation on how truth can vanish, not with a scream, but with a script. It's a case where justice may never arrive, not because the facts are weak, but because they were buried too early to grow. Still, people search. Not always for the girl, but for the moment things broke, for the thread that unraveled, for the silence that came too quickly, for the truth that might still be alive, even if no one is looking for it anymore. And that's where true crime must remain, not to assign blame, but to stand where light no longer shines and refuse to walk away. Not all crimes end in a courtroom. Some never even make it that far. They hover, unsolved but unforgettable, like fog just dense enough to obscure, but never heavy enough to collapse. The story of Madeleine belongs to that gray zone. No arrests, no trial, no verdict. And yet, something was lost. Something was concealed. Maybe even something was learned. This case reminds us that justice is not just about punishment. It's about clarity. About a shared sense that what happened has been understood, and that what's been done about it reflects that understanding. When that clarity fails, when the timeline wobbles and the evidence disappears into loopholes, we're left with a hollow echo. And in that space, suspicion lives longer than truth. But the lesson isn't just about the law. It's about the choices we make when panic meets power. If the theory is true, if a death occurred and was hidden, not by evil but by fear, then this case becomes a story about something painfully human, the urge to erase a mistake so completely that the erasure itself becomes the crime. We like our villains obvious. But real darkness rarely arrives with fangs. It arrives in whispers, in rationalizations, in the quiet calculus of risk. And once that first lie is told, it becomes harder and harder to remember where the truth even started. True crime at its best does not chase shock. It chases motive. It asks not just what happened, but why people do what they do, even the good ones. Especially the good ones. Because if fear can turn a parent into a participant in deception, even without intent to harm, then we are all closer to the edge than we'd like to believe. In the end, the story of Madeleine is not just about a missing girl. It's about a missing certainty and the cost of building a story when the truth is too heavy to hold. That's the lesson. Some lies are told out of cruelty, some out of shame, but the most tragic ones are told out of love and buried too deep to be found again.